The paper fell to the ground as if it weighed more than all her debts combined. Catalina looked down at it from above, kneeling on the dry earth, and knew she would remember that moment for the rest of her life. The man on horseback said nothing. He only observed her with those steady, serene eyes that revealed neither cruelty nor compassion. It was Don Evaristo Montoya, and what was written on that paper changed everything. Catalina closed her eyes. She breathed. And in that instant, as the wind of the sertão stirred dust between her fingers, her mind flew back to the beginning, to the day everything began to crumble. 5 years ago, the farm at Los Cardos was a vibrant place. Mornings began with the crowing of roosters and the aroma of coffee simmering on the clay stove. Catalina Ferreira da Silva was 32 years old, had 2 young children, a hard-working husband, and a piece of land that, though arid, yielded enough to live with dignity. Seu Armando, as her husband was called, was a quiet and steady man. He wasn't rich or powerful, but he was honest. He rose before dawn, returned at nightfall, and never complained about the heat or the drought. Catalina loved him with the kind of quiet love that is built slowly over years of shared work. The farm wasn't large. It had an adobe house with a tile roof, a small stable, 3 cows, some chickens, and a field that, in good years, produced corn, beans, and cassava. They had debts like everyone in that region, but they were manageable, under control, until the great drought arrived. The first year without rain was difficult. The second was desperate. The third was brutal. The river that crossed the property line dwindled to a trickle of murky water. The pastures scorched mercilessly under the sun. The cows grew thin. One died. The crops failed 2 seasons in a row. And Armando, who silently carried the weight of it all, began to sleep poorly. Catalina would see him in the early morning hours, sitting in the chair on the porch, staring into the darkness with slumped shoulders. She would get up, put her hand on his back, and he would just say, "We'll get through this." He said it with conviction, but his eyes didn't lie. To support the family during those hard years, Armando made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. He went to see Don Evaristo Montoya, the richest man in the municipality. Evaristo owned thousands of hectares, an imposing ranch, fine cattle, and, according to some, half the town. He was an elderly widower with no acknowledged children, and a reputation that inspired equal parts respect and fear. He wasn't violent. He wasn't rude. But he was tough. He knew how to negotiate. And when someone owed him money, he didn't forget. Armando asked for a loan. He signed papers. He promised to repay it with the next harvest. And Evaristo agreed, with conditions. The conditions were clearly written in legal language that Armando only half understood. Catalina read them later when it was too late to change anything. If payment wasn't made within the agreed time frame, the land would pass to Evaristo. Not just part of it, all of it. The house, the barn, the fields, everything. It was a harsh clause. Cruel, anyone would say. But Armando believed he wouldn't need to invoke it. He believed in the rain. He believed in the harvest. He believed in his own hard work. And for a while, things seemed to improve. The 4th year brought some rain. Not much, but some. The fields yielded a modest harvest, enough to eat and a little to store. Armando began to smile again. Catalina saw the color return to his face. The children, Roberto and little Lucia, ran among the rows of corn, unaware of the burden their parents carried. It was then that Armando fell ill. Not suddenly, gradually. A cough that started mildly and grew worse. A fever that came and never quite left. A weariness that settled in his bones and never let go. The village healer's remedies weren't enough. The city doctor charged what they didn't have. And in less than 6 months, Armando died in his wooden bed, Catalina holding his hand, the children asleep in the next room. He was 39. The debt to Evaristo remained, and the deadline was approaching. Catalina buried her husband in the small cemetery behind the village church. She wore black. She wept silently. And later, when the neighbors had left and the children were asleep, she sat in the same chair where Armando spent his sleepless nights, stared into the darkness, and said softly what he always said. "We'll get through this." She didn't say it with the same conviction, but she said it. And that was enough to get her up the next day. What Catalina didn't know was that Evaristo had already sent word, that the deadline was 30 days away, and that he himself would come to collect. The 30 days passed as difficult things often do, quickly and heavily at the same time. Catalina would wake up before dawn, make coffee, wake the children, send them off to the village school, and then head out into the fields with empty hands and her head full of numbers that didn't add up. She knew how much she owed. She knew how much she had, and she knew that the difference between those two amounts was impossible to cover in a month. But she didn't stay still. That was her nature. Armando always said that Catalina was like the jurema, that tree of the sertão that grows on stone, that bends with the wind but never completely breaks. It was true. She didn't know how to give up, or perhaps she didn't want to learn. In the first few days after receiving Evaristo's message, Catalina went to see every neighbor she knew. She went to talk to Don Ignacio, who had a small grain store in the village. Don Ignacio listened to her patiently, offered her water, and told her sadly that he, too, owed Evaristo money. She went to see Mrs. Benedita, Roberto's godmother, who was known for keeping her savings hidden under her mattress. Benedita wept with her, prayed the entire rosary for her, and explained that her savings were barely enough for her own burial. She went to speak with Father Cipriano, the town priest, hoping the church could somehow intervene. The priest listened to her, prayed with her, and told her he would speak with Evaristo. He did. Evaristo listened politely and told her that a contract was a contract, that he wasn't a charity bank, that he had lent the money in good faith and expected the agreement to be honored. The priest returned empty-handed and with sorrow in his eyes. Catalina thanked him and continued her search. She tried to sell the remaining cows, two thin old animals that barely produced any milk. The buyer at the market looked at them, touched them, shook his head, and offered an insulting price. Catalina negotiated. She lowered her expectations. She accepted less than she had expected. And even then, what she received wasn't enough to pay even a tenth of the debt. She sold the chickens too. She sold the farming implements that weren't essential. She sold the old wooden chest where Armando kept his tools. She even sold the wall clock that hung in the living room, the one that had been a wedding gift from Armando's mother. Roberto saw her take the clock down with her own hands and asked in a serious voice, with that strange seriousness children have when they understand more than they should, "Mom, are we going to lose the house?" Catalina looked at him. She was 8 years old, big eyes, just like her father's, and she felt her chest tighten with a force that hurt more than any blow. But she smiled. She stroked his head, and she said, "No, this is our house, and we're going to stay here." Roberto nodded. He believed her. Luzia, who was 6 years old and understood less than her brother but felt more deeply, clung to her mother's leg and said nothing. She just stayed still, pressed against her, as if her small weight could anchor her to the ground. The days continued to pass, and the debt remained the same. One afternoon, when there were 10 days left until the deadline, Catalina went to Evaristo's ranch. She didn't send a message. She didn't ask permission. She simply appeared at the door of the main house, in her black widow's dress, her hair tied back, her eyes dry, even though inside she was burning. The foreman made her wait in the sun for 20 minutes. Then he showed her into a cool room with dark wood furniture and a large crucifix hanging on the wall. Evaristo entered calmly. He was a man of about 65, tall, with broad shoulders that time had only just begun to soften. He dressed carefully, like someone who respected his own image. He had white hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. His eyes were light. Not cold, exactly, but they weren't warm either. They were the eyes of someone who had seen a lot and learned not to be surprised. He sat down across from her. He looked at her and waited for her to speak first. Catalina spoke. She explained the situation honestly. She told him about Armando's death, about the children, about the attempts she had made to raise the money. She didn't ask him to forgive the debt. She didn't expect that. She asked for more time, 6 months, a year if possible. She promised to work the land, to produce, to sell, and to pay with interest if necessary. She spoke in a firm voice, without crying. Evaristo listened to her until the end, without interrupting, without moving a muscle in his face. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted too long. Then he said slowly, "The contract has a date. Your husband knew you when he signed it." Catalina clenched her fingers in her lap. "I know," she said. "But my husband is dead, and I have 2 children." Evaristo looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up, which meant the conversation was over. "I'm going to think," he said. "I'll send you an answer before the deadline." Catalina left that house not knowing if she had gained something or lost everything. And as she walked back along the dirt road, with the sun setting behind her, she felt for the first time that fear was greater than her strength. But she kept walking, because there was no other choice. Evaristo's reply arrived 3 days later, not in writing. He arrived in person, on horseback, at dusk. when Catalina was on the porch mending the children's clothes in the last light of day. She saw him coming from afar along the red dirt road. She recognized his tall figure, his wide-brimmed hat, the slow, steady way he rode. She stood up. She put away her needle. She waited. Evaristo dismounted unhurriedly, tied the horse to the post on the porch, and climbed the 2 wooden steps with calm steps. He greeted her with a nod. Catalina offered him coffee. He accepted. They sat in the chairs on the porch, watching the countryside turn orange in the setting sun. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the wind stirred the dry bushes, and a bird called from afar. Then Evaristo spoke. He told her that he had considered her suggestion, that he understood the situation, that he was not a heartless man, even though many believed him to be. But he couldn't ignore a signed contract either, because his word and his signature were worth more than his money. He told her he had a proposal. Catalina listened without moving. The proposal was this. Evaristo would give her 1 more year, 12 months to work the land, produce, and gather what she owed. During that time, she could stay on the farm with her children, rent-free, without any interference from him. But at the end of that year, if the debt wasn't paid, the land would pass into her hands without further negotiation. No extensions, no pleas, no exceptions. Catalina asked if there was anything else. Evaristo hesitated for a second, barely a second, but she noticed. And then he added that, in exchange for that year of grace, he needed her to accept 1 additional condition. The condition was that during that year, Catalina would also manage a small portion of Evaristo's land that remained right next to the farm, an abandoned area that he had never been able to work properly due to a lack of local labor. It wasn't much, just a few hectares, but he needed someone trustworthy to supervise the seasonal workers, keep track of production, and report to him monthly. He would pay her for the job. Not much, but enough to help with daily expenses. Catalina listened to everything. She processed every word. And then she asked the question any woman in her position would have asked. She asked why. Why didn't a man with his power and resources simply hire someone trustworthy from the town for the job? Why was he coming to her door with this proposal? Evaristo looked at her with those clear, calm eyes. And he said something she hadn't expected. He told her he had been watching her for years. Not maliciously, carefully. He had seen her work alongside Armando, make decisions, speak firmly in the market, solve problems without losing her temper. He told her he knew many people in that municipality, and that people with that kind of character were harder to find than water in August. Catalina didn't know what to say. It wasn't empty flattery. He had said it with the same seriousness with which he signed contracts. And that, strangely enough, made him both harder to refuse and harder to trust. She asked for a night to think it over. Evaristo agreed. He got up, finished his coffee, and before getting back in his car, he said something else. He told her that her children seemed like good kids, that Roberto had the same serious eyes as Armando, and that he hoped she would make the right decision. Not as a threat, as an observation. But Catalina felt it in her chest anyway. That night, after putting the children to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a lit candle and Armando's original contract in front of her. She read it 3 times. She searched each clause for some hidden trap, some veiled intention, some loophole Evaristo could use against her if she accepted. She found nothing obvious. But that didn't reassure her. Men like Evaristo didn't need written traps. Their power lay in other things, in influence, in patience, in knowing when and how to move. Catalina thought about Armando, about what he would have said. Armando was prudent but not cowardly. She would have calmly assessed the risks and then acted. She tried to do the same. In the end, the answer was simple, though not easy. She had no other real choice. She could reject the offer and lose the farm in 7 days. Or she could accept, gain a year, work harder than she ever had before, and gamble that the land and her own effort would be enough. The second option was the only one that held any hope, however small. The next morning, when Evaristo sent his foreman to find out, Catalina told him she accepted. And from that day on, everything changed. The first month under the new agreement was the hardest, not because of the work itself, although it was hard, but because Catalina had to learn to navigate a world that wasn't her own. Managing Evaristo's land meant dealing with seasonal workers who didn't know her, who came from different towns, who were used to taking orders from men, not women, not young widows in black dresses with calm voices. The first day she tried to organize the work shifts on Evaristo's land, 2 of the laborers completely ignored her. They talked amongst themselves as if she weren't there. They made decisions without consulting her. And when she intervened, One of them, a burly man named Saraiva, looked at her with an unfriendly smile and told her that he had worked that land before she even knew where it was. Catalina didn't raise her voice. She didn't blush. She stared at him for 3 full seconds, which seemed longer than they were, and calmly told him that if he had any doubts about who was in charge, he could go and ask Don Evaristo directly. She would wait there in the meantime. Saraiva didn't go, but she didn't apologize either. She simply turned around and kept working, and the others did the same. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. As the weeks went by, Catalina gained ground, not with shouting or coercion, with knowledge. She arrived before everyone else, checked the soil, calculated the irrigation, and wrote everything down in a notebook she always carried under her arm. When a worker arrived with a complaint, she already had an answer. When there was a problem with the tools, she already knew how to solve it. Little by little, without making a fuss, she became someone worth listening to. At the same time, she worked her own land. The children helped as much as they could. Roberto, at 8 years old, already knew how to identify weeds and how to water without wasting water. Lucia tended the few plants in the family garden with a seriousness that made Catalina smile. In those moments when she saw her children working together in silence, she felt something that wasn't exactly happiness, but something close to it. It was the feeling that life, though broken, still had a shape. Evaristo came every 2 weeks to check on the progress. He arrived on horseback, alone, without the foreman. He dismounted, walked through the field, reviewed Catalina's notebook, asked precise questions, listened to the answers, and left. He made no unnecessary comments. He didn't praise or criticize without reason. He was fair in that sense. If something was good, he said so succinctly. If something was wrong, he said the same. And Catalina learned to read him. She learned that when he frowned slightly looking at the notebook, it was because something didn't add up. That when he walked more slowly through the field, it was because he was thinking about something he wasn't saying. And that when he looked toward the mountains before leaving, it was because something was worrying him, even though she didn't know what. One day, at the end of one of those visits, Evaristo stood beside his horse longer than usual. Catalina waited. He said, without looking at her, "You're doing good work." Nothing more. He mounted and left. Catalina stood for a moment in the same spot. Then she went back to what she was doing. But that night, sitting with the children after dinner, while Roberto did his homework and Lucia slept in her lap, she thought about those words. You do good work. They came from a man who didn't say them unless he meant them. And that gave her something money can't buy. It gave her the certainty that she was on the right track. The problem was time. The year was passing. And although the fields on her own farm produced more than the year before, thanks to some moderate rains that came in March, the debt was still large. The payment she received for managing Evaristo's land helped with the day-to-day expenses. But it wasn't enough to pay off what she owed. She needed an exceptional harvest, or some solution she couldn't yet see. One afternoon, while she was reviewing her accounts at the kitchen table, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Donna Perpetua, Armando's older sister, who lived in a city 3 hours away and hadn't been seen since the funeral. She arrived with a small suitcase and an expression that Catalina couldn't immediately decipher. She made her coffee. She listened to her. And what Perpetua came to say changed the course of everything that followed. Doña Perpetua entered the house with that way some older people have of taking up space without asking permission. She left her suitcase by the door, sat in the chair that had once belonged to Armando, and before Catalina could ask anything, she said directly that she had come because she had heard things. Things from the village, things that reached the city as rumors, and that she needed to know if they were true. Catalina asked her what things. Perpetua looked at her with those dark eyes that had something of Armando's eyes, although harder, more distrustful. She asked if it was true that Evaristo Montoya came to the farm every 2 weeks, if it was true that they spent time alone reviewing accounts and ledgers, and if it was true that the villagers were talking. Catalina felt something cold run down her spine. It wasn't shame. It was something more like anger. But she held it back. She explained the agreement in detail, the grace year, the administrative work, the payments, the ledger, everything. Perpetua listened without interrupting. When Catalina finished, there was silence. Afterward, Armando's sister said she understood the arrangement, that she didn't doubt Catalina's honesty, but that the world didn't judge men and women by the same standard, and that a young widow working for a wealthy widower without permanent witnesses, without family present, was a story the townspeople were already telling in their own way. Catalina gritted her teeth. She asked Perpetua what she proposed. The answer was unexpected. Perpetua said she was coming to stay, not for a visit. To stay. That she had settled her affairs in the city, that she had no husband or children to keep her there, and that if there was anything she could do for her brother's memory, it was to be present in that house while Catalina struggled to keep it. She didn't say it tenderly. She said it with the same firmness as driving a stake into hard ground. Catalina hesitated before replying. This wasn't the company she would have chosen. Perpetua was a difficult woman, direct to the point of being rude, with opinions about everything, and with the very marked habit of pointing out other people's mistakes more quickly than her own. But she was also family. She was someone who could help with the children, with the house, with the presence that was missing, and who, however awkward her arrival might be, came with the intention of defending Catalina from the rumors, not fueling them. She accepted. She assigned her the small room at the back, and from that night on, the dynamics of the house changed. Perpetua got up early, made the children's breakfast without being asked, took them to school when Catalina had to be in the fields from dawn, and kept the house in an order that Catalina couldn't always maintain. She also had opinions about everything, about how Catalina spoke to the workers, about how she kept the notebook, about whether the agreement with Evaristo was wise or a long-term trap. But on that last point, Catalina refused to argue. It was her decision, her risk, and her land. The children adapted quickly to Perpetua's presence. Roberto treated her with cautious respect. Lucia, who knew nothing of adult tensions, simply accepted her as if she had always been there. She called her Aunt Paitu because her full name was difficult, and Perpetua let her do so without correcting her, which was, in itself, a form of affection she wouldn't have expressed otherwise. When Evaristo arrived on his next fortnightly visit and found Perpetua at the farm, his eyes registered the novelty even though his face didn't show it. He greeted her politely. Perpetua received him with the coldness of someone who has already formed an opinion. Evaristo didn't seem bothered. He reviewed the notebook with Catalina as usual, walked through the fields, asked his questions. But before leaving, when he was already mounting his horse, he glanced toward the corridor where Perpetua was sitting sewing, and said in a low voice, just for Catalina to hear, "It's good that she has company." He said it without any apparent irony. As an observation, Catalina didn't reply, but she thought about it for days. Because in those 3 words there was something she couldn't tell if it was approval, indifference, or something more complicated than either. The farm's fields continued to grow. The March rains had been enough for the corn to thrive. The beans were promising too. Catalina calculated and recalculated. If the harvest went as planned, if market prices held, if nothing unexpected happened, she could scrape together a significant portion of the debt. Not all of it, but a substantial part, enough to negotiate perhaps, or so she hoped. What she didn't foresee was what was about to happen in Evaristo's fields. Something no one had predicted, and something that would change everything in an instant. The problem arose one Tuesday morning when one of Evaristo's farm workers came running to Catalina and told her that the main irrigation canal had broken. It was no minor accident. The earthen wall containing the canal had given way at a critical point overnight, probably due to the accumulated pressure from recent rains and years of neglect. As a result, the water meant to irrigate Evaristo's rows of sugarcane and sorghum was flowing in the wrong direction, flooding a low-lying, unplanted area and leaving the crops that needed it most without water. Catalina arrived at the site, saw the damage, and knew immediately that if it wasn't fixed within 48 hours, the harvest in that section would be lost. She sent word to Evaristo. Then, without waiting for a reply, she began organizing the workers. Not all of them knew how to repair a canal, but there were 2 veteran laborers, Tonico and Bellarmino, who had worked on irrigation projects for years and knew the procedure. Catalina called them, asked what they needed, and took care of getting it. Wood, compacted earth, straw, tools. She organized shifts so the work wouldn't stop, not even at night. She herself worked for hours under the sun, carrying sacks of earth, pointing out where to place the reinforcements, coordinating men who, under other circumstances, wouldn't have accepted her orders without resistance. But in that situation, there was no time to resist. They had to act. And Catalina acted with such clarity and speed that no one stopped to question her authority. Evaristo arrived that afternoon. He saw the work in progress. He saw Catalina in the middle of the field with her hands dirty with earth and her dress rolled up to her knees, giving Tonico instructions on the angle of the reinforcement. He said nothing. He walked around the damaged canal. He observed the repairs. He spoke briefly with Tonico, and then he approached Catalina. He asked her how she had assessed the damage so quickly. She explained. He told her he'd noticed that section of the canal had been showing signs of erosion for weeks, that he'd noted it in his notebook, but hadn't been able to reinforce it due to a lack of materials. Evaristo looked at her. He went to his notebook. He searched for the entry. He found it with the corresponding date, 3 weeks earlier. He read it silently. He closed the notebook and said nothing more about it. But Catalina saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. It wasn't exactly surprise. It was more like recognition. Like when someone confirms something they already suspected but needed to verify. The canal was repaired in 36 hours. The harvest was mostly saved. One entire row was lost, the one that went without irrigation for the first few hours, but the rest survived. Whenever Risto calculated what had been saved versus what would have been lost without the quick intervention, the difference was significant. Days later, he sent Catalina a message. Not through the foreman. He wrote it himself, in tight, clear handwriting. He told her that the work on the canal emergency had been handled better than he himself could have managed with his own previous administrators, and that in recognition of this, he was going to make an adjustment to the terms of the agreement. Catalina read the message twice. Then she read it aloud to Perpetua, who was sewing in the hallway. Perpetua stopped sewing and listened. When Catalina finished, there was silence. Then Perpetua said, without looking up from the embroidery she had resumed, "Be careful of men who give you things without you asking." Catalina put the message away. She didn't reply to Perpetua's comment, but she didn't forget it either, because there was something in that warning that resonated in a place in her mind where she herself hadn't yet dared to look. The children were in good spirits that night. Lucia had learned a song at school and kept singing it. Roberto had won a game of marbles with his friends from the village and was proudly showing off his winnings. Catalina watched them from the kitchen doorway and thought that those moments were the reason for everything. Not the land, not the agreement, not the notebook full of notes. It was them. And as she watched them laugh, she thought she would do whatever it took to make sure that laughter didn't have to end prematurely. What she didn't know was that the hardest test was yet to come, and that when it did, it wouldn't come from the fields, the canal, or the debt. It would come from a completely different direction. The test came in the form of a man Catalina never expected to see again. His name was Vittorino Ferreira. He was Armando's cousin, a distant relative, the kind who shows up at baptisms and funerals and when there's something to gain. He arrived in an old cart one June morning with a broad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a straw hat he wore tilted to one side as if it were a touch of elegance. Catalina vaguely remembered him from Armando's funeral. He hadn't been there long. He'd eaten, drunk coffee, offered his condolences with words that sounded rehearsed. And then he'd left. He hadn't returned until that day. He offered her coffee. He accepted. He sat on the porch with the exaggerated ease of someone who wants to appear to belong. He asked about the children, about the harvest, about how everything was going. Catalina answered with short sentences, giving no more information than necessary. She waited. She knew there was a reason for this visit. Men like Vittorino didn't travel for hours out of courtesy. Finally, after the second coffee, Vittorino brought up the subject. He told her he had heard about the debt with Evaristo, that he had also heard about the grace period agreement, and that, as a relative of Armando, as a man who wanted the best for his cousin's children, he had come to offer a solution. The solution was this. Vittorino knew a land buyer from a large city, a businessman who was interested in acquiring properties in that region. Not for farming, for a project he didn't specify clearly. The buyer paid well, enough to settle the debt with Evaristo and leave some extra for Catalina and the children to settle in the village or elsewhere. Catalina listened to the end. Afterward, she asked how much this buyer was paying Vittorino to bring the offer. Vittorino stopped. He looked at her with that smile that had become a little more strained. He told her that wasn't relevant, that what mattered was the family's well-being. Catalina said that for her it was relevant. She liked understanding the interests of the people who sat on her porch drinking their coffee. Vittorino shifted in his chair. He told her a percentage. It wasn't small. Catalina nodded. She thanked him for the visit. She said she would think about it. Vittorino left, still smiling, but with something different behind him. That afternoon, Catalina told Perpetua what had happened. Perpetua wasn't surprised. She said that Vittorino was just like his father, that he had been just like his grandfather, a line of men who found opportunity in the misfortune of others. That if he had come with a buyer, it was because someone had already put a price on the farm without Catalina knowing. That idea troubled Catalina more than she cared to show. If someone had put a price on the farm, it meant that someone was hoping she would lose it. That they were already counting on that possibility. Who? Evaristo himself? Or someone else? The next day, when Evaristo arrived for his bi-weekly visit, Catalina decided to be direct. She told him about Vitorino's visit. She told him about the mysterious buyer's offer. And she asked him, looking him straight in the eye, if he had any connection to the matter. Evaristo didn't blink. He listened. And then he said no, that he had no connection to Vitorino or any buyer of that kind. That if he wanted to buy more land in that region, he would do it directly, without intermediaries, and he would let her know clearly. Catalina believed him, not because she was naive, but because she knew his way of speaking. Evaristo didn't beat around the bush when he didn't need to. If he had wanted to buy her land through an intermediary, it would have been an unnecessary complication for someone who already had the contract in his favor. It made no sense. So who was the buyer? That question stayed with Catalina for days. And the answer, when it came from where she least expected it. Roberto, who had a habit of eavesdropping on adult conversations without being noticed, told his mother one afternoon that he had seen Vitorino talking to the town clerk in the town square, and that the clerk had written something down on a piece of paper. Catalina didn't immediately know what that meant, but she began to search, and what she found changed everything. It took on a much more troubling form. The municipal secretary's name was Osorio Brando. He was a middle-aged man who had held the position for over 12 years, and he knew every document, every record, every property in the municipality. He was also, according to the townspeople who spoke in hushed tones and looked at him before speaking, a man who did favors for certain interests in exchange for certain benefits that were never officially documented. Catalina went to the municipal office with a specific question. She wanted to check the record of her property, the one for the farm in Oscardos. She had the right to do so. It was her land, her name was on the documents, and she didn't need anyone's permission to consult them. Osorio greeted her with forced cordiality. He asked her to wait. He made her wait 20 minutes longer than necessary. Then he returned with a thin folder and showed her the documents. Catalina reviewed them calmly. She read every line, and she found something that shouldn't be there. There was a recent entry from just 3 weeks prior indicating that the property had an outstanding tax debt with the municipality, a debt that, according to the records, dated back years and had never been officially notified to the owner. Catalina asked Osorio about this debt. He explained with that bureaucratic calm that is a form of violence that the rural land taxes in that municipality had been updated 2 years prior and that many small landowners had outstanding balances without knowing it. That the municipality was in the process of notifying them, and that if it wasn't paid within the established deadline, the debt could have consequences for the property's ownership. Catalina asked how much the debt was. The amount wasn't enormous, but added to what she owed Evaristo, it was 1 more peso that changed the calculations. She asked why she hadn't received any official notification before. Osorio said that the record showed a letter had been sent, that if she hadn't received it, it was a problem with the rural postal service, that he couldn't be responsible for what happened after the documents left his office. Catalina left the municipality with the papers in her hand, and something she rarely felt. She felt fear mixed with anger. And when those two things mix in a person like her, the result isn't paralysis, it's movement. She went straight to find the only man in town who knew anything about the law. He wasn't a lawyer. He was an old retired schoolteacher named Seu Floriano, who had studied law in his youth before life took him down a different path. Seu Floriano listened to her patiently, read the papers, and told her what he thought. He told her the tax debt was real, that it couldn't be ignored, but that the way it was documented had irregularities. The tax update date didn't match the date of the supposed notification, and there was a municipal clause stating that debts on property couldn't affect ownership without a minimum formal notice period of 90 days after the first notification was delivered and confirmed. If Catalina had never signed the receipt for that notification, the period hadn't legally begun. That bought her time, but time was what she didn't have in abundance. That night she wrote a letter to Evaristo, not to ask for help, to inform him. She told him what she had found at the town hall. She explained the irregularities. She asked him directly if he was aware of the situation. The letter went the next day with the town messenger. The reply arrived sooner than she expected. The following afternoon, Evaristo didn't respond in writing. He came in person, and this time he didn't arrive on his routine visit. He arrived different. He arrived with an expression Catalina had never seen on him before. It wasn't anger. It was something more concentrated, colder, like someone who has received information that confirms something he didn't want to be true. He sat down in the corridor. He asked to see the papers. He read them. And then he asked for the secretary's name. Catalina gave it to him. Evaristo folded the papers carefully and put them in his coat pocket. And he said in a low voice, "This wasn't Vittorino's idea alone." Catalina asked what he meant. Evaristo looked at her, and he said something that completely rearranged the picture she had in her mind. There was someone else involved, someone with more resources than Vittorino and more influence than Osorio. Someone who had been waiting for Catalina to fail for some time. And that someone, according to Evaristo, was a person he knew very well. The name Evaristo mentioned was Salomão Peixoto. Catalina recognized him by sight. He was a man in his 50s, the owner of a land-buying company that operated in several municipalities in the region. He didn't live in the town. He passed through every so often in a large car, with employees who discreetly asked the residents who had debts, who was in trouble, and what properties might become available. It was a legitimate business on the surface, but his methods weren't always so. Evaristo explained what he knew. Salomão had set his sights on that area of the municipality more than a year ago. He wanted to buy several small properties, combine them, and sell the whole thing to an out-of-state agribusiness company looking to expand in the region. The Los Cardos farm was right in the middle of the land corridor Salomão needed. Without it, the project wouldn't make geographical sense. With it, the deal was worth much more. That's why Salomão had put Vittorino to work as an intermediary. And that's why Osorio had irregularly activated the tax debt to add pressure and expedite the process. Evaristo wasn't part of that plan. And that, though Catalina didn't say it aloud, relieved her more than she expected. She asked him how he knew all this. Evaristo said that Salomão had made him an offer as well. That if Evaristo fulfilled the contract for the Los Cardos farm at the end of the term and then sold the land to Salomão, he would receive a price well above market value. It was a clean deal on paper, but Evaristo had rejected it. Catalina asked why. Evaristo hesitated for a moment. Then he said that he didn't like being told how to use his contracts. That what he did with his property and his agreements was his decision and no one else's. And that Salomão had made the mistake of speaking to him as if it were already a done deal that the farm was going to change hands. That had upset him. Catalina understood that this was the kind of man Evaristo was. He didn't act out of abstract kindness. He acted on concrete principles, out of independence, out of pride perhaps. But the result at that moment was that he was on the same side as her, at least on that point. He asked her what she planned to do. Evaristo said he had his own ways of pressuring Osorio to correct the tax irregularity, that in that municipality his name still carried weight, and that if Catalina allowed him to act on that front, he would take care of eliminating that artificial debt. Catalina said she would allow it as long as everything was documented, that she didn't want solutions that depended on verbal agreements or favors that someone could later collect on. Evaristo looked at her with something that could have been respect or it could have been irritation. Or both. He said yes, that everything would be in writing. In the following days, Evaristo moved with the efficiency of someone who knows the power dynamics of a place. He didn't threaten Osorio. He didn't make a scene. She simply got the right information to the right people, reminded them which rules Osorio had broken, and made it clear that if the irregularity wasn't corrected voluntarily, formal channels were available. Osorio corrected the record in less than a week. The tax debt vanished from the documents as if it had never existed. Catalina signed the receipt for the correction, and she put it away with all the other papers in the same box where Armando's contract was. But that didn't solve Salomão's problem. He wouldn't give up easily. He had money, he had connections, and he had time. And Catalina knew it. Perpetua, who had been following everything closely, said so that night with her usual bluntness. She said they had won a battle but not the war, and that Salomão was going to find another way to exert pressure. Catalina nodded, and she thought about what she could do before that happened. The answer came to her as she watched Lucia sleep that night. It was simple, but it required something Catalina wasn't yet sure she could give. I needed to trust Evaristo, not just as a circumstantial ally, but for real. Trusting Evaristo wasn't easy. Not because he was a dishonest man, he was, within his own code, quite consistent, but because he was powerful. And Catalina had learned from a young age that power is not neutral. Power has its own gravity, and anything that gets too close to it risks being drawn into its orbit without realizing it. But it was also true that up to that point, Evaristo hadn't acted against her. He had given her the year's grace. He had responded to the canal emergency seriously and without recrimination. He had rejected Salomon's offer. He had taken steps to correct the tax irregularity. These were facts, and the facts outweighed her fears. Catalina made a decision, not impulsively, with the same deliberation she used for all her important decisions. She sat down with Evaristo one afternoon, after their usual notebook review, and brought something up. She told him that, given the circumstances, and given that there was a third party actively interested in her losing the farm, she wanted to propose a formal adjustment to the terms of the agreement. Not an elimination of the debt, not an indefinite extension, something concrete. She proposed that if by the end of the year she couldn't pay the entire debt, instead of transferring full ownership, a partial partnership be established. Evaristo would keep a portion of the land, proportional to what remained unpaid, while she retained the rest and the right to purchase Evaristo's share within 3 additional years. It was a scheme that her Floriano had helped her devise. Legal, documentable, and fair in proportion. Evaristo listened to the proposal in silence. He asked to see it in writing. Catalina had the paper ready. He read it. He folded it, and said he needed to think about it. 4 days passed. 4 days in which Catalina continued working as if the answer were already yes, because she couldn't afford to be fueled by fear. She planted, she supervised, she took notes, she calculated. And on the 5th morning, Evaristo appeared at the farm, unannounced, with a counter-proposal. He accepted the idea of a partial partnership, but he added a condition. If at the end of the year the harvest and income exceeded a certain figure, which he had calculated himself, his percentage would be smaller. In other words, the more productive the land was under Catalina's management, the less land she would lose. It was in fact a more generous proposal than she had expected. Catalina read the counter-proposal. She asked Floriano about it. So Floriano reviewed it carefully and said it was a fair document, that there were no hidden clauses, that if the numbers Evaristo had calculated were reasonable, the agreement was good for her. The numbers were achievable. Not easy, but achievable. Catalina signed. Evaristo signed. So Floriano acted as witness. And for the first time in months, Catalina felt that the ground beneath her feet was a little firmer. Not solid, but firmer. What neither of them knew was that Salomo Peixoto had been watching. He had people in the village who kept him informed of what was happening. And when he learned of the new agreement between Evaristo and Catalina, he understood that his plan of direct action had failed, that he couldn't use the tax debt, that he couldn't use Vitorino as an intermediary, that Evaristo wasn't an ally, and that Catalina wasn't going to surrender on her own. So he decided to change his strategy, and the new strategy was more subtle, more dangerous, because it wasn't directed against the land. It was directed against the people, specifically against Roberto. Roberto was 8 years old and had a boundless curiosity that couldn't be contained within the confines of the small village schoolroom. He liked numbers. He liked climbing trees. He liked talking to adults as if he were one of them. And he especially loved exploring the boundaries of the farm with a stick in his hand and the expression of a determined explorer. Catalina knew this, and within those familiar boundaries she let him. It was her family's farm. It was her land. And walking through it was a way of getting to know it that no school could teach. What Catalina didn't know was that Salomo had sent one of his employees, a friendly young man named Crisanto, to settle in the village under the guise of a tool merchant. Crisanto was good with people. He knew how to gain their trust, and he had noticed the boy wandering alone along the edges of the fields with such inexhaustible energy. He started talking to Roberto in the village square. He gave him a blue glass marble. He asked him about the farm with an interest that seemed genuine. Roberto, who was intelligent but still just a child, spoke to her. He told her about the crops, the repaired canal, his mother's notebook, and the agreements with Don Evaristo. Not out of malice, out of that innocence that mistakes attentiveness for friendship. Perpetua was the first to notice something strange. She saw Roberto talking to Crisanto from the window of Don Ignazio's shop. She didn't know him, and any stranger who paid attention to a child for no obvious reason put her on alert. That afternoon she asked Roberto about the man. Roberto described the conversations with enthusiasm. Perpetua listened without interrupting. Then she called Catalina. Catalina asked Roberto for more details. What questions had Crisanto asked him? About what topics? The boy answered honestly, without understanding why it was important. When he finished, Catalina and Perpetua looked at each other in silence. Then Catalina knelt before her son and explained to him carefully that some people asked questions not because they were friends, but because they wanted information, that it wasn't his fault. He was very clever. And from then on, if someone he didn't know well asked him about the farm, the agreements, or Don Evaristo, he should simply say he didn't know and that they should ask his mother. Roberto nodded seriously. He asked if that man was bad. Catalina told him she didn't know for sure, but that he was cautious, and that caution wasn't malice. It was intelligence. The next day, Catalina went to see Crisanto in the plaza. Alone, she looked for him, found him by his tool stall, and introduced herself directly. She told him she was Roberto's mother, that she had heard he had been talking to her son, and that she wanted to know who he was and why he was interested in the farm. Crisanto kept smiling, but his eyes changed. He told her he was just a curious merchant, that he liked the boy, that there was no ulterior motive. Catalina listened. Then he told him, with the same calm he used when speaking to the difficult farmhands, that in that town everyone knew each other, that secrets didn't last long, and that if someone was using a child to get information about his family, that person was going to have problems that no amount of tool sales could compensate for. He didn't threaten him with violence. He threatened him with visibility, with exposing his true intentions, and that, in a small town, was enough. Crisanto packed up his post 3 days later. He disappeared from the municipality. When Catalina told Evaristo what had happened on his next visit, he listened in silence. And in the end, he said something she wouldn't forget. He told her that Salomon had miscalculated from the beginning, that he had underestimated who he was dealing with. Catalina didn't respond to that, but she felt something that wasn't vanity. It was more like the confirmation of something she herself needed to know, that she could protect what was hers. Not just the land, her family too. What came next, however, would test that ability in a way that neither of them had anticipated. August arrived with a dry, oppressive heat. The crops held up because the irrigation system was well maintained, because Catalina had learned from the canal's mistakes and reinforced all the weak points before they could give way. The corn was tall and promising. The beans, too. The sugarcane in Evaristo's field grew so densely that Tonico, who knew plants better than anyone, was happy. Every night, Catalina added and subtracted. With the updated figures, if the harvest went as planned and market prices didn't fall, she could pay off a considerable portion of the debt when the agreement expired. Not all of it, but enough so that, according to the new terms signed with Evaristo, the remaining disputed land would be small, manageable. It was that month that Evaristo did something unexpected. He didn't go to the farm for his usual bi-weekly visit. He sent word saying he couldn't come, but that the foreman would come to check the ledger. The foreman arrived, checked it, made a note of it, and left without saying anything out of the ordinary. But Catalina noticed his absence, not romantically, nor with exaggerated significance. She noticed it as one notices any change in a routine that has become familiar. He didn't come the following week either. The third week, Catalina received a note from one of the women in the village who worked on Evaristo's ranch. The note said briefly that the boss was ill, that he had had a health episode that had left him bedridden, that it wasn't anything life-threatening, according to the doctor, but that he needed rest. Catalina didn't reply immediately. She thought, and then she made a decision that surprised Perpetua. She went to the ranch, alone, without prior notice. The foreman received her with surprise. He told her that the boss was resting. Catalina said she understood, that she wasn't there to bother him, that she was there to deliver something. She handed the foreman the updated notebook from the last few weeks, neatly filled out, with the progress of the 2 fields. And along with the notebook, a jar of honey that the village women used to treat sore throats and bronchial conditions. It wasn't an extravagant gift. It was simple, but it was thoughtful. Evaristo found out about the visit. 3 days later, he sent her a short note. He thanked her for the notebook and the jar, and he said he would be back in 2 weeks. Catalina kept the note. Perpetua saw her put it away and said nothing. Perpetua's silence was unusual. Catalina interpreted it as a sign that even she was reassessing her opinions about the situation. What no one knew at the time was that during the days Evaristo was sick, Salomão Peixoto had taken advantage of the situation to make moves. Not in the municipality, in the city. He had spoken with people at the State Property Registry Office. He had set in motion a legal process that questioned the validity of certain rural contracts signed under conditions of economic hardship. It was a broad strategy, not directed solely against Catalina. But she was on the list. And if that process moved forward, the contract between Armando and Evaristo could be challenged. What sounded like good news on the surface was actually a trap. Because if the original contract was invalidated, the grace period would also be invalidated. And the new partial partnership agreement that Catalina had signed with Evaristo would be in a complicated legal situation. It would be like starting from scratch. No agreements, no extended deadlines, nothing. So Floriano explained all this to her with infinite patience and an expression that spoke volumes. And finally, after a long pause, he told her that to stop that process, they needed to submit impeccable documentation to the state registry, in person, in the city, before Salomon's file moved through the bureaucracy. Catalina had 3 days, and she had never been to the city. The city was a 4-hour bus ride from the village. Catalina had never had a reason to go. Her world had always been that piece of the Sertão, that red earth, that horizon of Corrado and Caatinga. The city was another language, another rhythm, another scale of everything. Perpetua insisted on going with her. Catalina didn't argue. The children would stay with a trusted neighbor, Dona Firmina, who looked after them when needed and treated Roberto and Lucia as if they were her own grandchildren. The morning of their departure, before leaving, Catalina went into the children's room while they were sleeping. She stood in the doorway for a few seconds. She looked at them. She breathed. And she left. The bus left at dawn. Perpetua carried a bag with food for the journey and a folder with all the documents that Sir Floriano had prepared. Catalina carried another folder and the box where she had kept the original papers from the beginning. She left nothing important at home. Everything she might need went with her. On the bus, Perpetua spoke little. She stared out the window with the expression of someone processing many things at once. Catalina did too. The landscape passing by outside was the same old Sertão, arid and beautiful in its own way. But from the bus, it seemed different, vaster, quieter. They arrived in the city at noon. It was a place of long streets, multi-story buildings, and the constant noise of engines and horns. Perpetua knew the place better than Catalina and guided her to the registry office with a practical confidence that Catalina silently appreciated. The state registry office was an old building with a yellow facade, long corridors, and officials who looked at the papers before looking at the people. Catalina went to the appropriate window. She explained the reason for her visit. She handed over the documents. The official reviewed them slowly, without urgency, with the professional indifference of someone who does this 100 times a week. He told her he needed to consult with a supervisor, that she should wait. They waited 2 hours. The supervisor arrived, reviewed the papers in more detail, and asked technical questions that Catalina answered with her Floriano. Not in person, so Floriano had prepared written answers for every possible question and given them to her on a separate, neatly arranged sheet of paper. Catalina used them calmly. The supervisor nodded at some points. He frowned at others. And finally, he said that the documentation was in order, but that the process initiated by the other party already had a case number assigned. For Catalina's submission to have a suspensive effect on that process, she needed a specific signature from another official who was at a different location that day. Catalina asked if she could go to that location. She was told it would close in an hour. It was a 40-minute ride away. Perpetua was already on her feet before Catalina had even finished her question. They rushed out. Not literally, but almost. They found the ride, arrived at the location, took the stairs because the elevator was occupied, found the office, and Catalina submitted the documents with 3 minutes to spare before closing time. The official reviewed them. He signed, he stamped, and he said that the suspensive effect was recorded, that the other party's process would be suspended until there was a formal review. Catalina received the stamped paper. She held it in her hands for a moment. Perpetua, who was beside her, briefly placed a hand on her shoulder. She said nothing. There was no need. They spent the night in a small, inexpensive hotel near the bus station. Catalina didn't sleep well. She thought about the children. She thought about the harvest. She thought about Evaristo, who was still recovering. She thought about Salomão, who was going to find out what had happened and would look for another angle. There was always another angle. At dawn, they were back on the bus. At midday, they arrived in the village. Dona Firmina greeted them at the door with Roberto and Lucia, who ran toward Catalina with the urgency of children who don't fully understand absence, but feel it nonetheless. Catalina hugged them. She felt them, and she closed her eyes for a second. What she had won in the city wasn't the final victory, but it was a break, and sometimes a break at the right moment is worth more than a hasty victory. Evaristo recovered. He returned to the farm 3 weeks after his bout with illness. He arrived on horseback as usual, but with a slightly slower gait. His figure was still imposing, but there was something different, a slight lightness, as if his body had remembered its own fragility and couldn't quite forget it. Catalina greeted him in the corridor. She offered him coffee. He accepted, and before going to the fields or checking the notebook, she sat down and asked him, with that directness that was her way, how the trip to the city had gone. Catalina told him everything. Salomon's file, the race against the office's closure, the paper with the stamp. Evaristo listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked, "Were you alone?" Catalina said she had gone with Perpetua. Evaristo nodded, and then he said something that wasn't exactly a compliment, but was one of the most direct things he had ever said to her. He told her that she had done in 2 days what many men wouldn't have been able to do in 2 weeks, and that Salomon's case was now in a difficult position to sustain because the suspensive effect required the other party to present additional evidence of contractual irregularities that, in his opinion, did not exist. Catalina asked if he had access to information about the case file. Evaristo said he had contacts in the city, that he had sent someone to check on the status of the proceedings while he himself remained on leave. He told her that if Salomon wanted to continue, he would need to invest more time and more money than the business justified. And that businessmen like Salomon did the math, that when the cost exceeded the potential benefit, they looked for another opportunity, not because they were fair, but because they were efficient. That didn't completely reassure him, but it was a reasonable analysis. What came next, however, had nothing to do with Salomon or case files. It had to do with something much closer to home. That afternoon, when Evaristo finished checking the field and was about to mount his horse again, he stopped. He hesitated. It was the first time Catalina had seen him truly hesitate. Not the second of doubt that sometimes preceded a decision he'd already made. A real hesitation, something he hadn't resolved. He asked if he could talk to her about something unrelated to business. Catalina said yes. They sat down again on the porch. Evaristo looked out at the fields for a moment. Then he looked at her. And he told her that during the weeks he'd been in bed, he'd thought a lot. He told her he was 67 years old, that he'd lived alone for the last 12 since his wife died, that he had the ranch, the cattle, the money, that he had more than he could spend in the rest of his life. And yet there was something he didn't have. He didn't call it loneliness directly. He framed it with other words. He spoke of purpose, of having someone to review decisions with, of someone to trust not by contract but by choice. Catalina listened without moving, and when he finished, there was a silence unlike any other. Evaristo didn't make a proposal. He didn't say anything concrete, but the space between his words had a shape, and Catalina understood it. She didn't answer that day. She told him she needed time. He nodded and left. That night, Catalina didn't speak to Perpetua about what had happened. She went out into the corridor after the children were asleep, sat in the dark chair, and looked at the stars over the Sertão. She thought about Armando, about what she had built with him, about what she had lost, and she thought about what she had now, about what she could have. The two things weren't the same. They never would be, but they didn't have to be for both to be real. The following months were the calmest of the year, not because the problems had disappeared, but because Catalina had learned to navigate them without losing her focus. The September harvest was good, better than conservative estimates predicted. The March rains had been the start, but the steady work, the well-managed irrigation, the technical decisions she had made with Tonico and Bellarmino in the fields, all of it had added up. When it came time to sell at the regional market, Catalina negotiated with a firmness the buyers hadn't expected from a young woman dressed in black. She knew the prices. She knew the quality of what she was offering, and she didn't accept the first price they put in front of her. The final result exceeded projections, not by much, but enough so that, when added to the income from managing Evaristo's land, the total came close to what she needed to activate the more favorable terms of the partial partnership agreement. When she presented the figures to Evaristo, he reviewed them silently. He did his own calculations on a separate piece of paper. He compared them to hers. They were identical. That made him smile. A small, almost invisible smile. But it was there. According to the terms of the agreement, with that sum, Catalina only had to give up a small strip of land to the east of the field, the least productive, the one with the thinnest soil and the most difficult access to irrigation. The rest, including the house, the barn, and the central plots where the crops grew best, remained hers. Completely. It was a real victory. Not perfect, but real. Roberto understood this when his mother explained what the papers she and Evaristo had signed again that October meant. She told him that the farm was theirs, that they weren't going to have to leave, that the house where he had been born, where he had slept, where he had run among the rows of corn, was still his home. The boy nodded with that seriousness that Catalina had learned to love as one of the purest things she knew. Then he asked, "And Don Evaristo?" Catalina hesitated for a second. She told him that Don Evaristo was a good man who had helped them in a difficult time. Roberto nodded again. Lucia, who had listened without fully understanding, simply said, "I like Don Evaristo's horse," and that was all. The weeks following the signing of the agreement were strange in that there was no urgency. Catalina didn't quite know how to move forward without urgency. She had spent so much time solving problems, racing against deadlines, calculating and enduring, that the silence of not having to do all of that at once felt almost uncomfortable. Perpetua noticed. One evening, while they were having tea after the children were asleep, she told her that she seemed lost. Catalina said she wasn't lost, that she was resting. Perpetua said that for her, rest and loss had the same face. Catalina laughed. It was a small laugh, but it was the first genuine laugh Perpetua had seen from her in months, and that was worth more than any analysis. Evaristo continued to come to the farm every 2 weeks. They continued to review the notebook. They continued to talk about the crops, the weather, the markets. But there was something different about the tone of those conversations. It was more open, less transactional, as if the framework of the formal agreement had become more of a chosen habit. One afternoon, as they walked along the edge of Evaristo's field, the one that now bordered the seeded strip, he told her that he had formally rejected Salomon's proposal in writing, and that he had sent a copy of the rejection to the state registry, which left Salomon's case without further grounds. Catalina asked if that was final. Evaristo said that Salomon would continue looking for properties in the region, that he didn't give up easily, but that the Los Cardos farm was no longer the necessary link it had once been, that he had found another path for his project further north, and that the cost of continuing to fight for this land no longer justified the benefit. It was the end of that threat. Not dramatically, not with a moment of confrontation, but with the cold logic of business moving away toward where resistance is least. And as they walked back toward the house, Catalina looked at the earth beneath her feet, the red, dry, hard earth that had cost her everything, and she thought it was the most beautiful earth she had ever seen. Winter arrived in the Sertão with rains that were a gift after so much accumulated drought. It wasn't a city winter with cold and coats. It was the winter of the Northeast, which is really the rainy season, when the sky that has been closed for months suddenly opens and the ground that was dust turns to mud and then to life. Catalina stayed on the porch some nights listening to the rain. It was a sound she had learned to value in a way she hadn't known possible before. Each drop was a debt to the future being paid. Each puddle in the yard was a promise the land would begin to fulfill in a few months. The children went out into the rain without her stopping them. She let them. Roberto looked up at the sky with his eyes closed. Lucia splashed in the mud of the yard with a laugh that echoed throughout the farm. Perpetua watched them from the doorway with an expression that tried to be disapproving but didn't quite manage it. It was December when Evaristo asked the question directly. He had arrived that afternoon without the formality of the bi-weekly visit, without a notebook, without the pretext of the countryside. He arrived, dismounted, and asked Catalina if they could talk. They sat on the porch as usual, but this time there was no coffee and no documents on the table. Evaristo looked at her for a moment, and then he asked if she had thought about what he had said a few months before. Catalina said yes. Evaristo asked if she had an answer. Catalina hesitated, not because she didn't know what she was going to say, but because she wanted to say it well. She told him that she respected him, that he had been honest with her when he wasn't obligated to be, that he had kept every word of every agreement they had signed, that he had given her a year when he could have taken everything from her in 7 days. She told him that she had seen in him a man of character, and that character was the only thing that money couldn't buy. But she also told him that she was still a woman in mourning, that Armando had been her man for 10 years, that she couldn't rush things, that it wasn't the time to make that kind of decision out of gratitude or need or fear of loneliness. That if she ever made that decision, it had to be from a different place. Evaristo listened to everything without moving. When she finished, he nodded once. He said he understood, and he said he would wait, not as pressure, as a choice. Catalina didn't respond to that, but she let it be. Perpetua, who had overheard part of the conversation from inside the house, told Catalina that night that she had spoken well, that she had told the truth without hurting anyone or lying, and that wasn't easy. Catalina asked her what she thought of Evaristo now, after everything that had happened. Perpetua picked up a teacup. She held it in both hands, and said slowly, "I think Armando would have respected him." It was the greatest acknowledgement Perpetua could give, and they both knew it. The new year arrived without any grand ceremonies. Donna Firmina organized a small gathering at her house for the closest neighbors. There was food, there was music from an old radio, and there was that feeling that small parties in small places have, which are warmer than any big celebration precisely because everyone there really knows each other. Catalina went with the children and with Perpetua. Roberto fell asleep in an armchair before midnight. Lucia held on until almost 12 and then fell asleep in Catalina's lap, just as the year changed. Catalina carried her back to the farmhouse under the star-filled sky. She put her in her bed. She tucked her in. And she stood in the doorway of the room for a few minutes. She thought about everything that had happened in the year that was ending. About Armando. About the papers that had fallen on the floor. About Evaristo's horse. About the broken canal. About Vittorino. About Crisanto. About Osorio. About the bus to the city. About the paper with the stamp. About the numbers that had been closed. About the strip of land she had had to give up and the one she had managed to keep. About Perpetua sewing in the hallway. She saw Roberto with his serious, adult-like face, and she thought that life hadn't given her what she expected. It had given her something else, different, harder, but in a way she still couldn't quite explain, also more her own. And that night, as the new year began to silently unfold over the wet backlands, Catalina blew out the candle and went to sleep. The spring of the new year arrived with a different energy. It was as if the land had rested long enough to want to prove something. The crops responded to the winter rains with a bounty that Tonico called a blessing and Catalina called the result of a job well done. It was both. They weren't mutually exclusive. The fields of their farm produced with a regularity that no longer depended on the luck of the weather or the fear of debt. It depended on accumulated knowledge, daily care, and the decision not to give up when all the conditions seemed to favor it. Catalina had changed, not in the way people change when they lose something and become less. She had changed in the way people change when they discover what they are made of when circumstances demand it. She knew more about land than when Armando was alive. She knew more about contracts, records, markets, and negotiation. She could read people with a precision honed by pain and need. And she knew, above all, that her instinct to protect what was hers, not out of fear but out of conviction, was one of her most valuable resources. That year, Roberto was promoted at school, and his teacher sent a note saying he was the most serious student she had had in a long time. Catalina read it 3 times. Then she put it in the same box where the contracts and the paper with the city seal were kept. That year, Lucia learned to truly read, not just single words, but entire paragraphs. She would read aloud to Perpetua after dinner with comical seriousness and enormous satisfaction. Perpetua listened with genuine attention, correcting her pronunciation when necessary, and never telling her she was right when she wasn't. It was Perpetua's way of loving, and Lucia understood her better than anyone expected. Perpetua had decided to stay. She didn't announce it formally. She simply never spoke of returning to the city again. Her things were in the back room. His habits were ingrained in the household routine, and his presence, which had come to the farm as an imposition of circumstance, had become something Catalina wouldn't know how to undo, even if she wanted to. And she didn't want to. Evaristo kept coming, not just for work visits anymore. Sometimes he arrived for no particular reason. He sat on the porch. He talked about things that had nothing to do with the harvest or the contracts, about the past, about the years when this region was different, about what he had seen change. Catalina listened, and sometimes she talked too, about Armando, about how they had come to this land, about what she had dreamed her life would be and what it had become. Evaristo listened with the same attention she gave him, and in those moments, the line between the man who had had the power to take everything from her and the man who had chosen not to became more blurred. It didn't disappear, but it became more blurred. One day in April, when that year's harvest was already promising to surpass the previous one, Evaristo arrived with something different in his eyes. He sat down. He ordered coffee, and he told Catalina that he had made a decision about the strip of land she had given him as part of their partial partnership agreement. He told her he wanted to return it, not as a gesture, not as a courtship gift, but as a way of correcting something that, in retrospect, had been an unbalanced agreement. He told her that the land had been bought and worked by Armando's family, that it had come into their possession because of a debt that had been honored as fully as circumstances allowed, and that keeping it added nothing to his life that he didn't already have. But that for Armando's children, that land could mean a great deal. Catalina listened. She didn't answer immediately. She asked if there were any conditions. Evaristo said no, that it was a unilateral decision, that he had already had the paperwork prepared, that if she agreed, she only had to sign. Catalina looked at him for a moment, and he asked her directly if that changed anything about what he had asked her earlier. If returning the land was a way of changing his answer, Evaristo held her gaze and said no, that they were two separate things, that what he felt for her didn't depend on what she had or didn't have, that it never had been that way. Catalina nodded slowly. Then she told him that she accepted the return of the land, and that, regarding the other question, she needed a little more time. Not as an evasion, as honesty. Evaristo said that time wasn't an issue. The papers for the return were signed that week, so Floriano acted as a witness again. Roberto and Lucia didn't fully understand the ceremony, but they saw their mother sign with the pen, lift her eyes from the paper, and breathe in a way that seemed different, more complete. And that was enough for both of them to feel that something important had ended. Not the way things end when they are lost, the way they end when they are won. That afternoon, when Evaristo rode off on horseback along the red dirt road, Catalina stayed on the porch until he disappeared over the horizon. The sun was setting over the Sertón with that late daylight that turns everything golden. The crop swayed slowly in the wind. The adobe house with its tiled roof stood firm behind her, and the deed to the property, signed, sealed, complete, was inside that house, in the box, along with all the other papers that had marked the path from the first day until that one. Perpetua came out onto the porch, stood beside her, and also looked toward the horizon. For a while, the two women said nothing. Then Perpetua asked, without taking her eyes off the fields, "What are you going to do?" Catalina thought. And she answered with the only thing that was true at that moment. She said, "Continue.